How many draft picks can the Buffalo Bills actually roster in 2022? We answer that very question today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Thursday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, or if you're joining us on the YouTube channel, your first watch every day. As a reminder, we are on YouTube. Search Locked On Bills. You can watch the video version of the podcast if you prefer to see it that way. But however you want to consume the podcast, please do it that way. So, as we've gotten into this draft discussion for the Bills, one of the most common bits of feedback that I get is, can the Bills really roster all those draft picks? Can they really roster? Is it worth picking players that don't have a path to making the roster? And because I've seen that question and comment so many times, I want to take the time today to answer it. And right now, the Bills hold pick 25 in the first round. They have a second-round pick, number 57, third-round pick, number 89, fourth-round pick, number 130, fifth-round pick, number 168. They have sixth-round pick. They have two of them, 185 and 203. And then they also have pick number 231 in the seventh round. So they have 8 draft picks. They had 9 before they traded their seventh-round pick for Case Keenum. So is there room to roster 8 draft picks? Well, the Bills currently, as the recording of this podcast, have 65 total players under contract right now. And that can go as high as 90. Your roster in the offseason, before the cuts are due towards the end of preseason, you can roster 90 players. So technically, the Bills have room for 25 more players. You will see the Bills add 25 more players to the roster. Some of those will be draft picks. Some of those will be undrafted free agents. And some of those will be regular free agents that they add. So there's a lot more players coming to this roster. Now, the reality is only 53 of them are on the active roster, and then you have your practice squad. So the question we want to address is, how many of these guys, how many players, how many picks, how many of these 25 players that will be added to the roster have a reasonable path forward to being on the 53? Let's dig into it. Let's go position by position. Let's talk about how many players the Bills typically keep at that position, who the roster locks are, who's on the bubble, and then how many spots on the roster are available once you consider those first 3 data points. So that's what we're doing today. First up is quarterback. The Bills have typically kept 2 quarterbacks on the roster. The exception being a little bit of Josh Allen's rookie season when there was injuries, and they signed Derek Anderson and Matt Barkley. And then the COVID year where Jake Fromm was like this COVID player that didn't really spend time around the team, but he was on the active roster just in case. And then last year with Mitch Trubisky, they got back to just rostering 2 quarterbacks. I expect that to be the case moving forward. So your roster locks are Josh Allen and Case Keenum. I think those guys, that's your game day roster. That's your 53-man roster, Josh Allen and Case Keenum. On the bubble is Matt Barkley, and I fully expect Matt Barkley to go through the entire offseason with the team. He won't make the team during final cuts, and then he'll be signed to the practice squad as that Davis Webb type player. And so I think that's kind of your path with this quarterback room. So are there spots open? I wouldn't say there's any on the roster. And I think you're pretty satisfied with your Josh Allen, Case Keenum combination. But I do think it's worthwhile to consider a player to provide competition, but also a contingency for Matt Barkley. You are going to have to expose Matt Barkley to waivers. It's unlikely to me that somebody would sign him, but maybe a quarterback, a team that drafts a quarterback in the first round sees the value of a player like Matt Barkley and they want to sign him to be the understudy, or not the understudy, but be the guy that helps groom and mentor their young quarterback. It's possible. So I would want to have a contingency in place because you want that practice squad quarterback. And we saw the Bills last year, even when they only rostered 2 quarterbacks in Trubisky and Allen. We saw them last year have Davis Webb and Jake Fromm on the practice squad. And then obviously the Giants signed Jake Fromm off the practice squad. But they had 2 on the practice squad. So I do think that there is room for one other quarterback to be in the mix to challenge Matt Barkley and be on the practice squad. Let's move on to running back. The Bills typically keep 4 running backs. I think your roster locks are Devin Singletary and Tywan Jones. And I know you might be reacting some type of way to me saying Tywan Jones, but this guy makes the roster every year. He's a special teams ace. He's a gunner. He's a vice on the punt return team. He's going to make the team. So I think Singletary and Jones are your locks. Your bubble players are Zach Moss and Duke Johnson. So how many spots are open? Well, that could be your 4, right? You could be Singletary, Jones, Moss, and Johnson. That's your group. But I think we can all agree that at least Zach Moss is upgradable, and so is Duke Johnson. Duke Johnson was an afterthought for the NFL last year. He wasn't signed like all season long. The Dolphins bring him in late, and the Dolphins were desperate, right? They needed running back help. And they finally gave Duke Johnson a chance, and he played well. And I've always been pretty impressed with Duke Johnson every time I watch him play. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he's an absolute roster lock and that the Bills couldn't draft somebody that would bump him off this roster or Zach Moss. And so when I consider how many spots are open at running back, I think 1, maybe 2. Someone can beat out Moss and or Johnson. And so I do think that that's a spot where I would say, yes, there's absolutely room for a player to be added at running back that has a realistic path to make the team. Now, something I should have said already, but I'll say it now and keep this in mind as we continue navigating through these position groups, is that injuries change things really, really, really quick, right? You think you got the right number, somebody gets injured, and now you need a player. Now you need a player you're going to roster. And so things that aren't needs can become needs very, very quickly in the NFL. Let's move to wide receiver. The Bills have typically kept 6 wide receivers. I think there's 5 locks, to be honest with you. Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Isaiah McKenzie, Jamison Crowder, Jake Kumaro. I think those 5 guys are locks to make the roster. On the bubble, Marquez Stevenson. And then you also have Tanner Gentry and Isaiah Hodgins. Neither, I think, have a very clear path to the roster short of multiple injuries. So in terms of available roster spots, I would say there's 1. And the question you have to ask yourself if you're Brandon Beane and you're bringing in competition, which you will, there's going to be several more wide receivers added to this roster. But the question you have to ask yourself if you're Brandon Beane is, who can come in and actually beat out Marquez Stevenson? Because that's your bubble guy. That's your legitimate bubble guy. So if you're going to bring in a player, make sure that they're legitimately having a chance to knock off Marquez Stevenson, because they've not really kept 7 receivers. They've typically had 6. Now, I've advocated for 7, but it never really turns out to be that way. It's always 6. So if you add a wide receiver, make sure they can realistically challenge Marquez Stevenson. And I think that's a very realistic thing. I don't think that's an impossible thing for the Bills to do. I think they can draft a player in the first 3-4 rounds that can reasonably challenge Marquez Stevenson, and you improve your entire wide receiver core. So I think there's 5 locks at receiver. They'll keep 6, and there's 1 available spot. After months of playing, college basketball has determined the top teams for the Final Four and will determine this year's national champion this coming week. BetOnline.net is your number 1 source for all of your sports betting needs and info. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, they've got it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action, because BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, let's move on to tight end. The Bills typically keep 3 tight ends. Maybe that'll be 4 this year if the Bills really want to become a more 12 personnel heavy team. I can see that happening. But I think you have 2 locks right now. Dawson Knox, O.J. Howard. Those guys are making the team. On the bubble, you have Reggie Gilliam. I'm going to continue to classify him as a tight end. Tommy Sweeney and Quentin Morris. If the Bills go more 12 personnel and it's a staple of this offense, your third tight end can't be Reggie Gilliam because he's more of a hybrid type player, a special teams guy that plays fullback, H-back, tight end. You will need to have a meaningful third tight end to provide depth behind Knox and Howard. And based on the way the season finished last year, I don't really feel good about Tommy Sweeney being that guy. So how many spots are open? I would say maybe 1, potentially 2, if you're going to keep 4. If you're going to keep 4 and your top 3 are Knox, Howard, and Gilliam, then you absolutely need 1. That makes your team. So I'm putting down maybe 1 in terms of spots available. If the scheme shifts, you'll roster more. But the other thing to keep in mind with this tight end room is that none of these players are signed beyond this season. So if we're talking about tight end becoming an increasingly more valuable part of this offense, you may want to make sure you have some guys locked in beyond this year. Let's move to offensive line. I expect the Bills to keep 9 offensive linemen. And I think you have, when I separate the locks from the bubble players here, it's a little bit challenging to me. Because I think the 5 starters are locks, and then sorting out the depth behind it can go a number of different ways. So I think Deion Dawkins, Spencer Brown, Mitch Morse, Roger Saffold, Ryan Bates, those are your 5 locks. Those are your starters. They're making the team. So now you have room for 4 backups. And you have Ike Bacher, Cody Ford, Tommy Doyle, and Greg Mans. And you also have Jacob Capra, who's more of a practice squad caliber player. So you could have the 5 starters plus Bacher, Ford, Doyle, and Mans, and that's your room, right? That's your 9 offensive linemen. But I would also bring to everyone's attention that there's a reasonable chance that Ike Bacher starts the season on the PUP list, which is the physically unable to perform, and he's out for the first 6 weeks of the season. And you get a free roster spot from that. So I think you at least have to account for a player stepping into that role, but you also want to have competition for this depth. There's no reason right now that we should say Greg Mans, Ike Bacher, Cody Ford are roster locks, right? They deserve to be competed with. Even Tommy Doyle. I like what Tommy Doyle did as a big tight end last year, but there's a good chance this is the player you look at and say that's your swing tackle. He's one step away from going in and replacing Spencer Brown or Deion Dawkins. It's a very important depth role on your team. So when I think about spots and how many are available, again, Ike Bacher potentially going on the PUP list, competition for the depth, I would say realistically, at least one, maybe two spots are open here. Let's move on to defensive tackle. The Bills typically keep 4 or 5 defensive tackles, and there's 4 locks in my mind. Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones, Tim Settle, Jordan Phillips. So if you keep 4, you're set. Now, again, injuries change things very, very quickly. But if that's your defensive tackle room, I think you're in good shape. They're all going to dress. They're all going to play. Your bubble players are Brandon Bryant and Eli Onquo, which is a really nice pair of guys that project as your practice squad type players that you can call up. So I really like the makeup of this room. Now, you'll add another player or two here to fill out your camp roster. But realistically, your top 6 guys pretty much set. And I look, there could be a scenario in the draft where the value is too good and you have to draft the player. But short of that, I don't think you're going into this draft thinking we need to find a player that can realistically challenge to make our team, because that's a tough path. At defensive end, the Bills typically keep 5. Last year they had 6, so I would say they would keep 5 or 6. Your roster locks, in my mind, are Von Miller. Little pause of appreciation to remind ourselves that Von Miller's on the team. That's awesome. Greg Rousseau, Boogie Basham, AJ Epinesa, I consider them to be roster locks. On the bubble, I have Shaq Lawson. And then, of course, there's Mike Love, who I think is a practice squad player. Maybe you're surprised for me to say Shaq Lawson is a bubble player, because if they keep 5, I think Miller, Rousseau, Basham, Epinesa, Lawson's a really good group. But I have a hard time reconciling what happened to Shaq Lawson last year, where he was traded from Miami to the Texans. The Texans trade him away. He goes to the Jets. He gets cut. Like, he didn't stick on 3 teams that he should have absolutely had an opportunity to play on. Now, maybe he comes back to Buffalo, best version of himself. It's the right environment for him to play well, and he goes back to what we saw in 2019, and you're really happy with that. And he's an absolutely not just a rosterable player, but one that you want to mix into your rotation. And like I said, I think there's a reasonable chance the Bills could keep 5 of them. It's Miller, Rousseau, Basham, Epinesa, Lawson, and you're happy. But I didn't feel quite comfortable at this point just bumping Shaq Lawson into the absolute roster lock category. So how many spots do you have open here at defensive end? Maybe 1, maybe. But the question you have to ask yourself here, and this is just like what we did at wide receiver, is that player that you bring in going to be better than Shaq Lawson? Can they realistically take that job from Shaq Lawson? Again, injuries change things very, very quickly. But I don't know that there's a real path for a defensive end to make this roster again, unless there's a ridiculous value that falls into you. You pick them, and you have to keep them. Let's move on to linebacker. I think the Bills will keep 5 or 6 linebackers. And this is an interesting position as well. This is a lot like what we talked about for offensive line, where you have your starters, and then sorting out the depth could go a number of different ways. So the only locks that I'm going to consider at linebacker are Tremaine Edmonds and Matt Milano. Then on the bubble, you have this entire crew of reserve players in Tyrell Dodson, Andre Smith, Markel Lee, Joe Giles Harris, and Tyler Medikevich. I think there's a good chance Tyler Medikevich jumps into that lock tier, which means you have 4 players in Dodson, Smith, Lee, and Giles Harris to take 2 or 3 spots. Now, as we consider how many spots are actually available at linebacker, it's hard because I can fully be convinced that the Bills could draft a linebacker in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round. that would represent an upgrade to all of those backups. Very realistically, I think that's true. So sorting out the depth is weird. You may look at this and say, wow, we've got our 5, we got our 6, no problem. We like this. But simultaneously, you look at this depth and say, every bit of it's upgradable. What do we really know about Dotson, Smith, Lee, and Giles Harris? What we know is that they've been around. But how good are they at playing football? I think we need to see more. And honestly, outside of preseason, I hope we don't. So sorting out the depth is weird. I would say there's space for one player. Cornerback. The Bills will typically keep 5 cornerbacks. Your locks are Trey White, but again, good chance that he starts the season on the physically unable to perform list. He'll miss the first 6 weeks of the season, and you don't account a roster spot for that, so you get an extra spot. Dane Jackson, Taron Johnson, Saron Neal, I would consider as locks to make the roster. On the bubble, Cam Lewis, Nick McLeod, Elijah Griffin, and Tim Harris. Cam Lewis has been around for a little bit now, and he actually played quite well in the slot against Houston last year in week 4 when Taron Johnson missed that game. And so figuring out how much confidence they have in him as a player that could dress on game days and be that guy opposite of Dane Jackson, it's tough to know right now. But he's the leader in the leading candidate in my mind to be that player. So how many spots are open? I think 2. When you consider Trey White potentially starting the year on the PUP list, I mean, that creates a spot, and then you still have another spot available. Like, even if Trey White was completely healthy right now, you have Trey White, Dane Jackson, Taron Johnson, Saron Neal. That's 4. You got to get to 5. So unless you think that's Cam Lewis, you absolutely have place for another player. So I think the Bills can realistically add 2 more corners to this roster that will dress and make this roster. And I hope it's a veteran. I hope the Bills sign some veteran like A.J. Bouye or Joe Hayden, something like that, and then draft a player in the 1st or 2nd round. That's what I hope happens. So the Bills absolutely have space at cornerback. At safety, the Bills will keep 4 safeties. I think you have 3 locks in Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, and Jaquan Johnson. Your bubble players are Damar Hamlin and Josh Thomas. And so in terms of roster spots, I don't think there are any. I think if your top 4 safeties going into next season are Hyde, Poyer, Johnson, and then either Hamlin or Thomas, you're happy with that. And then either Hamlin or Thomas goes to the practice squad. So I don't feel like there is a path for a safety to make this roster if they drafted one. Let's move on to specialists. You'll keep 3 specialists, right? A long snapper, a kicker, and a punter. Your roster locks are Tyler Bass and Reed Ferguson. Your bubble player is Matt Hawk. And so you have 1 spot open, right? Because you want somebody to come in and replace Matt Hawk. You want a better punter than Matt Hawk. So what's the conclusion here? We went through all these positions. We sorted it out. We talked about how many they would keep, who the locks are, who's on the bubble, and how many spots are open. Conservatively, I want to give you a conservative answer and an aggressive answer. Conservatively, I think the Bills can roster 7 rookies. Running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive line, linebacker, cornerback, and punter. Those are the 7 spots conservatively that I think the Bills could roster a rookie. Aggressively, I think there are 11 spots that the Bills could roster a rookie. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, 2 offensive linemen, a defensive end, linebacker, 2 cornerbacks, and a punter. Again, that's the aggressive side of things. Like I put quarterback in there. That's assuming you keep 3 quarterbacks and you find one that's better than Matt Barkley and you don't want to have one in your practice squad. I mean, that's when I say aggressively, that's the type of stuff I'm considering. So what would I do? What would I prioritize? I would make sure that I came out of this draft as things stand today, right? Things will change. The Bills could add players and change this completely. But I would prioritize, and this is not in any particular order, so please don't think there's anything to the order. I would prioritize finding a running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive lineman, cornerback, and punter. I would prioritize finding one player at each of those 6 spots that will make my roster, that I think is there is a reasonable path for them to make my roster. Now, what does that mean? What does all this mean? The Bills are currently sitting with 8 draft picks. And I think that they need to find probably at least 5 and as many as 7 players that can realistically make their team. So the Bills have some flexibility. If they want to move up, they can do it. If they want to move back and then up, right? Move back, gain even more draft picks to give you the ammunition that you need to move back up, you can do it. But I'd be surprised if the Bills just sat there at all 8 of these picks and just picked a player. I think that they're in a good spot to be aggressive, to go get players that they like, that they feel like can actually help their roster and make the roster and challenge depth spots and even in a couple of places starting spots. But the good news is Brandon Beane has set himself up well to be flexible, to move around, and find players that he thinks can actually make this team. And so, no, when the Bills had 9 draft picks, I thought that was aggressive to think 9 players could realistically make the team. And I know that we're sensitive to this because the Bills have lost 3 draft picks recently, signed off the practice squad because they couldn't roster them. Jack Anderson, Jake Fromm, Rashard Wildgoose. And I know that you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's pretty pointless. Now, fortunately for the Bills, they've been very healthy, which is not normal how healthy the Bills have been. And you're normally tapping into your depth a whole lot more than they've had to over the last couple of years. So that definitely plays into this entire conversation as well. That's a contributing factor as to why the Bills couldn't keep some of those guys that got plucked off the practice squad. So hopefully this was a helpful conversation to listen to sort out the question, how many rookies can actually make this roster? Let me know what you think. Let me know if this conversation was enlightening to you and you're more adverse to Brandon Beane aggressively trading up because you want him to maintain 5 or 6 draft picks, 6 or 7 maybe, to find meaningful competition. Or if you feel like, Joe, I feel like you were pretty aggressive in your approach here, and I want Brandon Beane to be aggressive because you were too aggressive and there's less space than you think. And the Bills have been healthy, and I expect that to continue. Let me know what you think here in the comments on YouTube, or, of course, interact on social media, and let me know your thoughts. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. Looking forward to tomorrow's podcast. If there's no breaking news, I'm thinking we'll do some mock draft stuff. So don't miss it. Make sure you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.